Joining us online, we have with us Joel Turkewitz, Deputy Unit Chief of the IMF's Legal Department. After 20 years of working with the World Bank, he joined the IMF, where he specializes in anti-corruption and rule of law with extensive country experience across Asia and Africa. Welcome, Joel.
But greatly appreciate the chance to speak with you. I just want to show you that I have a copy of the governance diagnostic here with me, which I try to carry at all times. So great to have a chance to just talk to you briefly about the governance diagnostic as a way of starting the day for this, I think, really interesting workshop. And what I'd like to do is just provide a little bit of context about what the governance diagnostic is and why the IMF did it, a little bit about what the governance diagnostic found and what some of its core recommendations were. But I think most importantly, and as kind of a send-off for the day, most importantly is to talk about sort of what comes next. Now that a set of recommendations have been defined in the document, what is going to be needed in order for those recommendations, or in order for the whole sort of ideas about how to systematically address corruption and improve governance and public sector performance, what's going to be needed in order for these issues and these reforms to really take hold and change governance and outcomes in Sri Lanka. So with that, let me start by talking a little bit about the governance diagnostic. First, the governance diagnostic is a first one that was done in Asia. It's a tool that the IMF has created starting in 2018, and there have been about 20 of them which have been done, and this was the first one that was done in Asia. The governance diagnostic is done at the request of governments. So the government of Sri Lanka requested the IMF to do this report, and I think it's very important here to understand that request, as well as the IMF's approval of the request and doing the report, was based on a mutual recognition that addressing corruption and governance weaknesses are essential for successful reform and future prosperity. And that what had gone on in Sri Lanka, or in the last several years, was both an economic crisis as well as a governance crisis, and that responding effectively in ways that would create prosperity and create new ways for the government to operate and new ways for the government and the public and people to interact would going to require substantial analysis and understanding of what the nature of the problems were, as well as a set of clear and committed recommendations and actions to change the situation. I do also want to emphasize that even before the governance diagnostic was done, the IMF had understood and had made governance issues an important dimension of our program. So one of the very first things when the IMF was re-engaging in Sri Lanka that was done was an emphasis on the passage of the anti-corruption law, the new anti-corruption law. So there had already been an identification that corruption issues were critical. The governance diagnostic was a recognition and a further work on this, but also a commitment to a public discussion of governance and corruption. That what would happen would be there would be an analysis and a report that would be made public and enable both public discussion, public monitoring of what the government was doing in response to the recommendations, and that's what we'll move on to next. So let me talk very briefly about the diagnostic itself. So the diagnostic is an effort that looks at the severity of corruption and governance weaknesses and corruption vulnerabilities in core state functions, those functions that are essential to sound fiscal and monetary policy. It gets done by a team of people working across the IMF in a variety of different departments. And for Sri Lanka, the team consisted of 13 different people, and which was a team that I led overall. And the team looked at both a variety of documentation, as well as had interviews with government officials, with civil society, with the business community, with international community, to try and understand what was the nature of the corruption challenge in Sri Lanka, and very specifically, how did corruption influence and affect the way government functions in things like how central bank governance occurs, how financial sector oversight happens, how fiscal governance takes place, so issues around budget and expenditures and taxation, how issues around money laundering and counterterrorism financing occur, as well as issues around the rule of law. How does the judicial system function? How does the judicial system function specifically around contracts and property rights? And finally, a look to see how are the anti-corruption laws and legal frameworks and organizational frameworks designed and operate to address those corruption risks. So there is a process that occurred over around 6 to 9 months that did that analysis and came up with a report. As has already been said, the report was published at the end of September. I think it's quite important to understand that when the report was published, it was published both by the IMF and the government of Sri Lanka. So it was a report that is, while the IMF was the leading analytical party, it's quite important to understand that this is a report that the IMF did, but with the participation and approval and acceptance by the government of Sri Lanka. And it's important maybe just to get a sense of the diagnostic for the people who haven't seen it. The diagnostic sort of in some way ends with 16 priority recommendations. Those recommendations span that whole set of issues that I spoke about, and things like publication of asset declarations for senior officials on a designated website by July 2024, or publication by March 2024, publication on a website of all public procurement contracts above 1 billion, a list of all firms receiving tax exemptions, and a list of tax exemptions on luxury vehicle imports. It has things like abolish and suspend application of the Strategic Development Projects Act, or revise regulations and processes relating to financial sector oversight in the banking sector, or establish and implement a plan to expand the resources and skills available to the Judicial Service Commission in order to improve access to justice and equality and justice. So there are some very specific recommendations that are priority recommendations. In addition to the priority recommendations, there are approximately 60 additional complementary recommendations that we also think are critical, and the expectation would be that the priority recommendations would happen first, and then that would create space and room for additional recommendations. I know that in today's discussion, you'll take up kind of each of these different areas with a discussion about what's going to be needed and core areas in order to make progress. What I want to do in the last couple of minutes that I have to open is to talk a little bit about, so what are the next steps? What are the next steps that after the diagnostic was been published? So the first thing that I think is quite important is the diagnostic is not seen as an end in itself, but very much as the beginning of a process. So what has happened since the diagnostic came out is in February of 2024, the government published its action plan, which was a set of commitments around the actions it will take to improve governance and address corruption that are drawn from the diagnostic recommendations. There's also a commitment that the government will report on progress every 6 months in its action plan. And at the end of each year, there will be a revision of the action plan and both an extension of the action plan. So it's a rolling action plan of reforms that are based upon the diagnostic recommendations. So it is a commitment, the government has made a commitment to take action on the reforms. It's also made a commitment to act on those. That commitment is then also supported by the IMF as well as other development partners in our program. So there are a range of structural benchmarks in the IMF program that you might have seen that relate to the implementation of these recommendations. So there is a structural benchmark on the implementation of the transparency portal, that the recommendation that I read around procurement. That has been met. There's a structural benchmark on the publication of asset declarations of top government officials that is for July of this year. So there are built into the IMF program support for these recommendations and support for the implementation of these actions, as well as a whole set of capacity development support, both by the IMF and other partners, to assist the government in implementing those recommendations. But what I also want to emphasize, and as in the final sort of statement, is then what next is things like this, which is public discourse about the reforms that are taking place, about what reforms are needed for Sri Lanka, as well as public monitoring of the government in terms of its actions on its commitments. So that what happens if the governance diagnostic, as in some ways a holistic effort to understand and suggest ways to improve governance in Sri Lanka, is to have real consequence, it will be through the combined efforts of both the government and people like yourselves who are actively involved in participating in governance, in understanding and having dialogue about what reforms are critical, and in publicly monitoring the government's progress and supporting and insisting upon progress as governance changes to improve the lives of Sri Lankan citizens. So with that, I want to stop here. And in some ways, as clear, this is just in a lead-in to the discussions that you'll have for the rest of the day on the different topic areas which I think are critical and essential. And I salute Advocata for organizing this discussion, which I think is a critical step in movement towards better governance in Sri Lanka. Let me stop there. But once again, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to speak with you. And I wish you all a very good day.
Thank you very much, Joel.